Once again, Ghana is celebrating the visit of a major U.S. government official. In this case, we're talking about the Vice President of the United States of America, Madam Kamala Harris. And she's here on the back of many other U.S. presidents who've been here before. And so there's a lot of hype when it comes to the Ghana-U.S. relations. But really, whilst we celebrate another visit, we need to ask the fundamental question. What really is in it for us? We've been blocking a lot of roads, rolling out the red carpet for her, especially in this time when we are facing the biggest economic crisis of a generation. Many have argued we need the U.S. more now than ever before. But what really do the facts say about this relationship? It's an important relationship. But if you put it in comparison with other powers in the world, I mean, should we possibly be inviting Xi Jinping to Ghana and giving him a bigger, longer red carpet? Maybe Putin even? I know those are controversial thoughts to have, but let's look at what the numbers say. And then let's come to our own conclusions as far as this is concerned, because really Ghana is broke now. What we need is money, somebody to bail us out. Let's see who has shown the will to help us out. But there are bigger issues also. The bigger issues, helping to fight terrorism, helping Ghana's image at the global level, influence at the IMF. So there are other important factors. You know, the conversations that, for example, happened about LGBTQ. So there are a lot of controversial issues too when you look at our relations. And so look at a few things. So she's been in Ghana, but as I've just mentioned, a few more have been here. We've had William Clinton, you know him. Bill Clinton was here. And I remember I was in Saito then when Bill Clinton arrived, 1998. I was just about finishing my junior high school in the Dabraka. And then they told us we have to go and queue by the roadside. They gave us Ghana flags and the flag of the United States. We're waving whilst Bill Clinton passed, and I believe I saw him in the car, very close up. I was a kid in my Saito, very proud Saito and Dabraka, waving, standing in the sun, and enjoying the fact that I'm seeing Bill Clinton. So that's it in 1998. I remember that very well. And then of course we have George Bush also came in. Where was I when George Bush came in? I don't quite remember. But he was here in 2008. Yeah, I remember. Okay, I remember now. I mean, when he and, before, and no wonder we named George Walker Bush Highway. So that's an important relationship. That highway that I use every morning on my way to work and back home, named after him, rightly so. We'll tell you why, because of huge amounts of money they pump into infrastructure. But talking about infrastructure, there's some other country, another superpower, who would lay claim to the title in terms of a relationship with Ghana. Barack Obama, that famous one, 2009. So that's an interesting one, right? So back to back, 2008, 2009, 2 years consecutively, we had a sitting US president visiting Ghana. So many will look at that and say, well, that relationship is indeed very special, right? So, well, let's go on. And then we have Kamala Harris now, who is also here, tracing his roots and visiting the castle as Barack Obama did, both of them people of color. So very interesting indeed, and that's why it's become a big subject of conversation. What have they been talking about? Peace and security has been a key issue on the table. President Akufo-Addo wants the issue addressed, and so he's talked about Al-Qaeda not being here. But most importantly, the U.S. With Kamala, Mrs. Harris, have announced that they're giving $100 million to a number of West African countries to fight terrorism. Democracy is another important factor that has come up indeed. And then also the issue of inclusive growth has come up. The U.S. is pushing for the IMF bailout for us. Madam Harris has told us that they will be making a case at the Paris Club for them to consider us. And so both of them have been making statements on this, on the threat of terrorism, and then also President Akufo-Addo called on the U.S. to work with ECOWAS to protect nations from terrorist groups. And that is an important point that Ghana has been pushing with the US. US is a superpower when it comes to the military interventions. But then the economic relations is something we need to look at a bit closely. Because if you look at the point I was making about, for example, the investment of the Millennium Challenge Corporation's $308 million into the power sector, it is a major investment. And then you look at the investment that we saw with the George Walker Bush Highway, it's another major one. And then you look at the duty-free access to the US market that we have for over 1,800 products. It's another big one. So those are some of the key things to look at when it comes to the US-Ghana relations. But I find this interesting as we begin to drill down the numbers. We're measuring how important this relationship is and what's in it for us. This is a graph that tells you about 1.8 billion trade and donation. So we are talking about this is not trade. This is, as far as grants are concerned, aid to Ghana from the US. And I find it interesting that in 12 years, the United States of America has given Ghana 1.89 billion. I mean, you must add only to this number, only 1.89 billion in 12 years. And if you do the averages, and the graph tells you a story, you are in a region of this $130 million a year over 12 years. I mean, come to your own conclusions and make of that as what you will. But if you look at the graph, for example, in 2013 and 2023 already, we are talking about $40 million is what they've given us in terms of donations, let's say grants. And if you go to 2022, we have 183. I'm curious, in the COVID years, 2020, 2021, 2021 we had some 2022 we had some $99 million, and then 2021 we have some $109 million. Many countries gave far more than the United States, keeping them honest, as far as the COVID is concerned, as this graph shows here. And then, you know, Ghana is currently in the grips of trying to restructure its debt, right? And I find this table very interesting, without restructuring this multilateral, bilateral debt. We're not getting an IMF due. But look at the numbers. Look at the numbers. We'll look at but this is for the meantime. Let's look at trade, and I'll come to the subject of the debt restructuring for you very shortly. If you look at the trade, for example, $29 billion in total. That is, together. But if you look at China trade, disregard this for a second. Just look at here for me. China, in terms of import, we are importing as much as $6.75 billion worth from China alone. Where is the United States? United States of America, we are importing $787 million. What about exports? If you're doing export destinations, China is third as far as Ghana is concerned. We're doing 1.52 billion export to China. In fact, top 5. United States is not even in the top 5 when it comes to our export destinations. Although, as I said, we have this trade partnership with them, a market for us. So that should tell you a story. So you're asking yourself, if you look at these numbers, right? Import, China is leading significantly. Export, China is leading again in terms of relationship with us. Who are you rolling the red carpet for? If you're looking at pure numbers. But in geopolitics, it's not only about the numbers. But for a country in the debt crisis, broke, there's a strong argument to be made that we possibly should be inviting Xi Jinping, right? $6.75 billion, right? And in terms of import, and then a lot more in terms of exports. United States doesn't even come in here when it comes to export destinations. And so that tells the story. And then the debt restructuring. That's why I asked you to disregard there for that slide. This particular title applies to this particular detail and numbers. And this is interesting. China, in terms of our exposure, debt to countries. China, our exposure is 1.7 billion. The Paris Club, there are 22 members of the Paris Club. And this is what I want you to look at. including the United States, 22 countries, permanent members, together is 1.9 billion. China alone, money that they give us, loans that they've given us, amounting to 1.7 billion. So that should tell you a story. That should tell you how China is really the benefactor when it comes to helping Ghana deal. Look at the infrastructure that we've seen. They built the defense ministry for us. They've helped us with, so the argument has to be made. What really is in this relationship with the United States for us? And I'm going to get the experts to look beyond the numbers, maybe, because if I'm looking at the numbers, I'm thinking that maybe we should put in a call to Xi Jinping to come to Ghana and let's see if we can give him a bit more of, some treat here and there to see if they can increase this for us, because US doesn't do much when it comes to helping us out in monetary terms to deal with our poverty, right? They try, but China is doing far more. So that's the story there. And then the key questions with my guest when we return. Samuel Okudzeto-Ablakwa is here with me in the studio. Via Zoom is Professor of Economics, Professor Godfrey Bokwin, because this is a big matter for us. Economics are important because of the current crisis. We'll talk to him about it too. How much should we be getting from this US? And isn't that a big deal? I mean, they say they'll help us with the IMF, but really, how much of a big deal is that to help our with our problems? And then we'll talk to the international relations expert also. Stay with me after this break. Thanks for staying with us. Samuel Okudzeto-Ablakwa is the ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament. Also, Professor Godfrey Bokwin is a professor of finance at the University of Ghana Business School, and Dr. Ishmael Hlobo is an international relations analyst, will join us also. Let me start with you, Sam. So I'm pretty sure, have you been invited to any of Kamala's events?
Yes.
You have
yes,
been, okay.
Yes.
So you had an opportunity to...
I was invited to the dinner, which was held in her honor yesterday. But there was this tragic development in my constituency, terrible accident over the weekend. And so the Joapon community is in a state of mourning. We lost 6 of our compatriots in Joapon. And I spent the whole day visiting families. There's 1 survivor at the hospital. So by the time I was done with all of those visits, the day was really gone. So I missed out on the dinner last night. But it's been a good visit from all indications. Ghana is becoming a very popular destination for United States presidents and vice presidents. The last time a vice president was here was in 1957, President Nixon. We've had
Nixon was here.
Yes, during
was it before?
Yeah, he was quite close to.
Oh, because that was way before the
way before he became president and the Watergate scandal.
Yeah.
So he came in as vice president. Then we've had President Clinton. As you gave the intro, I also.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You also stood by the roadside.
Yeah, we're from Presec. It was virtually compulsory for all the students in Accra. It was quite a memorable visit. I always remember President Rawlins's fugu over his white shirt. And President
when the beast passed and you spotting to see him and waving
under the scorching sun for many hours. But it's a lasting memory that we have, our generation. And then interestingly, President Bush followed from another party, continuing with the tradition. So the Democrats had come, the Republicans followed, and then President Obama. And this time I was Deputy Minister for Information and got involved in the planning. I was in the planning committee.
That's 2009.
Yeah, that was a very historic visit. So you had the first African-American president of Kenyan background, but deciding that he will visit Ghana. Yeah. There must be something about Ghana. Now you have Vice President Kamala Harris, who grew up at some point in Zambia. But in terms of the arrangement, she decides to visit Ghana first and to visit the castles and forts which remain iconic symbols of that dark history, which Ghana has now become noted for in terms of the Year of Return commemoration. And she did deliver an emotional speech. I was listening to her earlier in the day to decide that she'll visit Ghana first on this 3-leg tour. From here, she goes to Tanzania and then to Zambia for obvious reasons. Her maternal grandfather had worked in Zambia for a considerable number of years. She grew up there at some point. She hasn't returned to Zambia in more than 3 decades and is making a return. But coming to Ghana first, being the first black and female vice president of the United States of America, the symbolism is significant. And it tells you that the example that we are on the African continent, our stability, our democratic credentials, and the fact that we remain a role model nation for many African countries, despite our setbacks, particularly in the economic arena. It is in the economic arena that we have not acquitted ourselves creditably with this debt restructuring and the current economic meltdown that we are all facing. So you notice that in her speech, she has been eager to give us assurances that America will be there for us. She's speaking to the Paris Club. She's committing to also putting a word at the IMF to make sure that we do get a program and all of that. Clearly, they are all concerned that Ghana, the huge reputation we have, the fact that we are such a strategic ally, they would not want the Ghanaian economy to collapse. All the many years of strategic alliances. It's not only the monetary aspect, but if you come to consider the fact that Ghana has been a hub for all kinds of, deployments. If you look at even when Ebola struck, remember that President Mahama had made a case at the United Nations, and the US and other Western nations had agreed to use Ghana as the logistics hub through which they were more comfortable to work through Ghana to reach out to the affected nations. You look at even the Millennium Challenge account, you notice that Ghana was a special case from AGOA all the way. And so in terms of all of those strategic alliances in health, public health, in security, in education, in trade, we really are an important nation to the Americans. Then don't forget that currently, in terms of the geopolitics, we have a seat at the Security Council. We are one of the 10 non-permanent countries at the Security Council. And with what is going on, every now and then, there is a need for a critical vote at the United Nations on the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. I remember that Africa has not been, if you like, decided, voting in a unanimous way. The last time the count was done, Africa was virtually divided. A good number of African countries abstained. And the Americans will want to have more allies. On the case of Ghana, you say that our president has already committed. So that gives further impetus. The Americans feel more comfortable to deal with us. But they would want to consolidate that, alliance. But don't forget that China and Russia have not given up. So if you're following the geopolitics, you see that there has been renewed interest. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has been touring Africa very, very busily. I mean, if you look at his trips abroad, Africa has dominated from January. He's been to Mali, he's been to Mozambique, Sudan, Eritrea. He's been very busy. And Sergei Lavrov is, if you like, the primus inter pares of all foreign ministers, very well regarded. If Sergei Lavrov is in your country, it's very much like Putin is in your country. And he has been really busy, attending to African concerns. He's been to South Africa recently. Russia, China, and South Africa did those, military games that they exhibited to the world, which the Americans were not too comfortable with. Then don't forget, China is also consolidating. They haven't moved out at all. Because in the case of the Americans, there has been a break where when Trump came in, Trump didn't care much about Africa. He never stepped foot throughout the entire 4 years. It was his wife who did limited visits. Then he ran into trouble with us, remember, in 2018, when he made that infamous S-hole speech, which African diplomats at the United Nations held a press conference and condemned. The AU also condemned that speech. He didn't do much to redeem his image. So the Americans now want to undo the Trump era of, if you like, seeming neglect and demeaning the relationship that historically has been phenomenal, if you like.
But you're making a point.
So China, I was talking about China. Don't rule out China's role. China has been the more generous of the three superpowers, and they don't have a lot of these traditional conditionalities. You must meet this democratic standard, this human rights record, and all of that. It's transactional. And many African countries have been comfortable with China too, because the history with China has been, if you like, more friendly, not checkered. Don't forget that with the Americans, we have the Euro-American slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. You know, in our recesses, they have not paid compensation, which is one of the issues African leaders have been raising now. Only last year, there was a major summit here in Accra. Our president renewed the call for reparation. The Jews have received reparation for the Holocaust from the Germans, running into in excess of 83 billion. Africa has not. All we get every now and then is an apology. Last year, the Dutch were the latest to apologize to us, but nothing material, really, in terms of, you know, compensatory or reparative justice. All they have said is that, look, we'll set aside some 204 million for scholarships, but that's not adequate if you compare, you know, the Holocaust, you know, to what slavery has done to the continent and continues to do even to the psyche and to the dignity of Africa. So with China and Russia, they don't really have this past, no slavery background, no colonial, you know, relics, you know, lingering in the historical trajectory. So they have over the years built themselves as some natural allies, and because they've also come in to support in strategic moments. The South Africans, for example, why Russia continues to be very popular, is that when America was labeling ANC as a terrorist organization, when Nelson Mandela was on the watch list as a terrorist, the Russians saw apartheid as what it is, injustice, and declared support for the blacks and strategically supported them right through to the Battle of Quito Carnival, when USSR and, you know, Soviet forces aligned with, you know, troops on the continent, and that was seen as the last, if you like, blow to the apartheid forces. So all of this historical narrative has made, you know, the US a bit jittery.
Let's ask that controversial question. And do we have Professor Godfrey Bokwin with us? Dr. Ishmael Holber is on. I'll come to him shortly on the points that you've made. In fact, let me bring him in on that point. And I'll come to the economic question. Which of these countries should we then be laying the red carpet for? Because remember, this is happening in the context of an economic crisis, the biggest in our generation. And so right now, we need money. We need food. Accommodation. That's all we need. We need somebody to forgive our debts. But if the man who is holding the bigger chunk of your debt is China, and, you know, if you really look at the numbers, as I showed you, the U.S., together with the Paris Club of 22 countries, 1.9 billion, China alone 1.7 billion, maybe, sure, we're putting a call to Xi Jinping to visit also. I'll come and ask that question, then we'll go to the other things. But let me bring Dr. Holber into the conversation. Doc, you've watched what has been playing out in the last few days with Kamala. Are we overstating the importance of this relationship with the United States? Are we overstating it? Or is there a real basis to really roll out the red carpet when they turn up? If you drill down to the benefits we get, is this an overstated relationship?
Good evening to you and good evening to your listeners. I would not say that it's an overstated relationship. It is a relationship that is still significant to our development and our quest to move out of the economic difficulties we find ourselves. If you look at the US and look at the global economic structures, particularly within the IMF, where you are looking to get some relief from, the US still has a very significant role within the IMF setup to play. Therefore, well, your largest creditor, as it were, is China. The US still remains a very important friend to Ghana, and therefore any top-level visit to Ghana should be treated as such. Apart from getting us to get maybe an IMF deal, there are other economic aspects of this kind of visit. For instance, the international media that is covering this event gives visibility to our country. As she is gone to the castle, there's still the media presence that broadcasts that area, and therefore it is very important to our tourism industry. And also, when you look at the terrain in West Africa over the last few years, the terrorist activities within the sub-region, you will still need a lot of U.S. presence and support in order to deal with some of the challenges we are facing, both by sea and by land. Remember, Ghana is a coastal state, and then along the Gulf of Guinea, where we have most of our oil installation in the sea, piracy and other sea-bound activities are also challenges to us. And the U.S. have been instrumental in trying to equip, in trying to support training for many security forces. So yes, apart from this current issue of trying to get an IMF deal, the U.S. still remains an important friend to Ghana, but that doesn't mean that we should overly lean to the side of the U.S. We need all the other players, like the Chinese, for instance, to come on board. Of course, if you look at China in Africa, they have strategically over the years invested in key sectors so that if you look at the data, the U.S. is a distance, I think if you take a country, it's a distance that when it comes to trade with Africa. So you have the EU as a collective bloc, then you have the Chinese, then you have the US, and then you can talk about the others. So now that they are trying to re-engage, it is important we keep this engagement as such. Remember, Ghana is a democracy, and therefore, naturally, the US will find it quite comfortable to come here. And they have an interest. When you are dealing with a region that recently is having problems with democracies going back, and then you have one that looks a little bit stable, then you have to find a way to reassure them that the path they have chosen is good, and therefore you are always there to give them the needed support. So I think that in both ends, there's some interest that is at play, and it is not a relationship that we will say that it's overstated. Of course, we are interested in the Chinese. Of course, the foreign minister was there last week trying to negotiate with them. These negotiations have to go side by side. We don't need to downplay one side because of the other. That is the crucial thing that we have to look out for now, not to fall into the geopolitical trap where you assume that one side is more beneficial to me, so you link to that side. If you do that, you may
but in this relationship, I mean, if the visits are anything to go by, it doesn't appear that we are so. I don't know whether the Chinese themselves aren't coming or we aren't inviting them into the conversation. I mean, because you see publicly there is a sense you get that we hop up quite easily with the U.S. in terms of their government officials than we do with the Chinese. There's almost this tension that you almost feel when a Chinese state official is hobnobbing with a Ghanaian official. I mean, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding it also in the past. Aisha Wan, the Galamsey issues. So there's always a tension. The senior minister got into big trouble when he suggested that, you know, our diplomatic relations in China is almost being determined and dictated by one woman. So that tension has existed. Yet, and I get your point, you know, balance the relationship. But it doesn't appear we balanced this well between the two superpowers.
You see, the point is that Ghana as a nation has always been culturally more Western because of our historical past.
Yeah, we are taking a lot of money from. We take a lot of money from the so-called, you know, non-West, which is China and Russia and all that.
So I'm bringing up a narrative. When it happens like that, I think Honorable made the point that we are still suffering from some of the effects of slavery and colonialism, and our image about good or bad, our image about Chinese is influenced by the paradigm of this Western past that we adopt, so that we tend to see things from the West more favorably than things from China. A typical Ghanaian, when you say that a goose is from China, he tends to adopt a kind of skeptical attitude towards it than the goose from the US or Britain, because then that aspect is associated with quality. So if you look at it very carefully, you need to deconstruct the narrative, the image of China, which is being held by both the public and state officials. Of course, the engagement with China has certain aspect of tension because of, as we said, the Galamsey issue, and how we seem to go around the Galamsey and to project the Chinese as being the problem. In actual fact, when we go into the details of the Galamsey, the Chinese man in China doesn't know where the gold is. So if you are not dealing effectively with your own people who are collaborating with the Chinese who come in to aid them do the kind of business they are doing, and you then put the image of Chinese as if they are the ones who are solely responsible for the problem, then you create this kind of artificial tension that we see.
Yeah, but that's precisely my point, right? I'm just asking this because of the point you made, that we should make this relationship between between the United States and the rest of the powers. We should have an equal dealing with them, if you may. But it doesn't appear that we're doing that. I don't know whether we are deliberately.
Of course, currently, I agree with you that currently it seems that we seem to be more comfortable with the US and the Western partners. And if you look at some of the events that have preceded the visit of the second the second in command in the US. So, for instance, you look at president going to the US and some of the comments that came out. Then you think that we are becoming a little bit pro-Western, as it were. So, but then within that, it is imperative we recognize that our bread is not buttered by one side alone. It is buttered better if we engage
and that's a perfect point. Hold on for me. Let me bring that to our bread is being buttered heavily by China. Heavily. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. You can't run away from it. US is a drop in comparison to China. So let's stay with the economic argument for a second, because really where we are now, that's the most important conversation we should have, because we are poor, we are broke, we need saving, we need food. China appears, obviously, it's giving us far more. Yeah. So who should we lay the red carpet for? Longer, thicker, nicer red carpet? China or the US?
So this is a difficult question. As a people, we are renowned globally for our hospitality. Let's remember that they are visiting us. And the quintessential Ghanaian hospitality, we will roll the red carpet. We will warmly embrace you. We will accept you when you decide to visit us. Perhaps we should be asking, why is it that we probably haven't had high-level visits of this nature from our other bilateral partners. So you have had U.S. Vice President with us currently. Not too long ago, a few weeks ago, you had a cabinet minister, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Greenfield, visiting us. And then you are seeing all of these other visits, Yellen, then Blinken. You see a certain interest in Africa. But in Ghana, you are seeing this high profile. Remember that when the government delegation wanted to go to China earlier, they were stopped, that they're having the Chinese Communist Party meetings. Interestingly, at that same period, a key ally was received in Beijing. And this is a key ally in Eastern Europe, was received in Beijing when Ghana was stopped. When you consider all of that, and you consider the fact that when Sergei Lavrov also decided to hold a very large, broad-based African tour, he left out Ghana. It is not lost on these people. And remember that China and Russia have formed a certain interesting relationship. Recently, Putin hosted President Xi. And President Xi has even presented a roadmap, which Putin appears more comfortable with, a roadmap for peace in Ukraine. So my honest impression is that we don't seem to have played our foreign policy very well as Nkrumah did. How is it that Nkrumah, who was perceived to be ideologically pro-East, however, he was able to have all of these, superpowers feel comfortable with him? Remember Akosombo Dam, which was his flagship project. Absolutely. He had the West fully funded. US, UK, World Bank, fully funded. They supported him. At the same time, the Russians were here helping him.
Even when the CIA was trying to kill him, they still sponsored the Dam.
Exactly. And the Russians were here comfortably helping him to pursue his nuclear power vision. And remember that the atomic agency, but for the coup of 24 February 1966, will have become a nuclear giant. And the Russians were helping him do that. The Chinese were also here, strategic alliances, particularly in the education sector, for science and technology education and all of that. So how did Nkrumah do that? I think that he was more skillful with his foreign policy. I think that statements like, the Wagner Group, we are not comfortable with them, we must get rid of them. I think the president was a bit, too, upfront and a bit undiplomatic with how he did that. Immediately, it created the impression. And so I'm not surprised that when later on, he set up this committee to go around looking for cheaper fuel. Everybody knows that in the world today, the only place to get cheaper fuel is Russia.
No wonder we saw
they failed.
Ships now arriving
and
at
now,
the port, and the suggestion is that it's possibly coming from Russia.
Exactly.
Eventually.
So I think that there is a sense that we have not played our, historic, very strategic, skillful, more nuanced role very well. We've departed from that tradition that led us to be founding fathers of the non-aligned movement, where all these Western powers were comfortable with. Because look, as Nkrumah has said, look, let's focus on the African personality. We look forward, not east, not west. And remember that our constitution says that our foreign policy must be determined by our national interest. Article 40 is very clear. Article 73 is very clear.
So our national interest right now is to bail out. This is a bailout.
Exactly.
That dictates that China should be our best friend right now.
Yes, and yet you have your president who, in terms of, listen to the speech our foreign minister gave at the Security Council against Russia. Yeah. Many people thought that she was a bit too bombastic. Yes, we, as a country that has been colonized before, we get insensitive towards, if you like, dominant powers who want to. We don't support that kind of conduct. But there's also a way you go about it. That does not appear, there's a way you scold even your child that it doesn't look like it's born out of, hate or you want to be destructive. So I think that we could have been a bit more skillful, a bit more strategic. And that is why I'm not surprised that we're struggling to get the kind of audience. Because, look, to be honest, many analysts believe that Beijing played hardball.
Yeah.
So far, it's not clear if they have agreed. The finance visa has returned, but we don't have clarity. I had a meeting last week at the Chinese embassy, and there's still no clarity. They can't tell you if really they have agreed to give us that, external restructure, that external reprieve. I think so. I think that our hardline position against Russia, remember that Putin and Xi are so close. If Putin puts in a word that, hey, these guys, why are they on our back? Remember that the embassy here has had to issue about 4 statements, which is quite, unusual for an embassy to be issuing statements.
Russian embassy.
The Russian embassy here. And saying that, look, you guys, stop blaming us. Leave us out of your economic. Yeah. We are not responsible for your economic woes. And they even did their own research and presented a list of items that we import. And they didn't think that, really speaking, based on the data, they are responsible.
So you're saying we should be courting China as hard as we are courting the US.
As hard as we are courting the US. And we should not position ourselves as anti. And I think that's what some of the other African countries are doing. Look at how, even on this trip, Vice President Kamala Harris from here is going to Tanzania. Where was the new Tanzanian president's first visit to? China. And that's what has even made the Americans...
Has a president been to China?
Our president, not in recent
times. The US a lot.
Yes, a lot, but not. It's even. It's even back there.
So that's the point that you're making.
Per my tracking, he arrived there at 2:21. This
afternoon. The US, the president is back in the US.
Yes,
so that's the point you're making. That if we are playing this right, according to what our national interest objectives are right now, the president should be flying to China.
Yes, and
possibly not to the US.
And should be courting more. I mean, I have nothing against. I would endorse friendly relations with the US and with everybody else as much as possible. Be at peace with everybody. I believe it's a biblical doctrine. I believe in it. But don't be skewed. And in terms of your strategic national interest, yes, you want the Americans to talk to IMF, but you are also talking to the Chinese to give you debt restructuring. Exactly. Without them, it's a condition precedent.
It's a good point to bring in Professor Bokwing on this.
You need everybody.
Prof, where do you stand on this conversation? That the Americans, we are lovey-dovey with them. It's nice. However, what is the reality when it comes to how much economic benefit do we stand to gain from the Americans as opposed to the Chinese in this time of economic crisis?
Yeah, thank you very much, Evans. Good evening to my co-panelists and good evening to your cherished viewers and listeners. So if you look at the historical data, I think that China has been more helpful to the continent, not only Ghana, in the last 25 years. Actually, what the data is telling us is that in the last 25 years, while the Paris Club creditors were busy organizing sending off parties for themselves in terms of their developmental assistance to the continent, China stepped up to the plate. So if you look at China's developmental footprint on the continent, it's quite visible. Now, what is playing out is that there's a new scramble for Africa within the context of the global geopolitics of alliance building, which is trying to unsettle the traditional building blocks that we have. So you look at it and you see every country, when they are fashioning out a strategy, they are looking at what can be levers or leverage, what they can leverage on. And all the continents, you check the data that have developed, including, essentially the global north, at some point in time, actually used Africa as a stepping stone, including Ghana. Okay, so in as much as we need these countries, they also need us, right? So there's a certain sense that Africa has gone largely the way of China. Okay, and if you look at China's alliance with Russia within the BRICS concept, you see that there is some kind of leaning towards that. You can check South Africa's relationship with Russia and China and look at their posture at the UN General Assembly and all of that, and even their posture with respect to the Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of them. So you can see that Africa itself, we don't have a common strategy with engaging the rest of the world, okay? That drives our engagement so that we are able to negotiate from position of strength and all of that. So all of that is playing out here. But I think that, and of course, I agree with the, I didn't join early, but I think that Ghana wasn't strategic in how we played our part in all of this global geopolitics. We were not. I'm not too sure Ghana had a clear strategy in navigating its way through the emerging issues underlying the global geopolitics. I'm not too sure we had that. Because if we did, we would have been very mindful in terms of our comment and posture and the excessive display of alliance, which really wasn't necessary at that time. I think it wasn't necessary at that time. If you look at what the Paris Club creditors all put together have given to Ghana relative what China alone has given to us, you see why China is a big issue in that picture. But if the sole aim is necessarily to get an IMF program, then actually the $1.7 billion that we owe China is not really a big deal. It's not. If you look at the composition of the external debt, we may be majoring on the minor, because I believe that with considerable expenditure cuts, right, and all of that, we should be able to help close the gap in as much as we get external help. We should look at it that way. I feel a bit uncomfortable the way we exhibit our vulnerability just because we want an IMF program, because we are just not showing that we are responsible for our problems and that we'll be able to do something about it.
And Prof, but just in the interest of time, let me ask you this very briefly. One of the biggest things you hear when our government is reaching out and calling onto the US is putting a word for us at the IMF. And we had the US say, oh, we'll help you, we'll intervene for you, we'll put in a word for you. How much of a value really, in terms of real substance, does that carry in terms of swaying the IMF executive board in our favor, in spite of all the challenges we have? Can we bang on that? Can we go to the bank on that and cash that check?
I think that to some extent, we have made some gains along that line. And I'll give you an example. If you look at the speed with which the IMF mission team reached staff level agreement with Ghana, I believe that there was some considerable pressure from Washington.
Okay.
I think so. I think so. And I think that, in all of this, because now it's obvious now that the hole that has to be closed is so big. And is the reason the IMF doesn't want to approve the program. Because look, Evans, if you pick the deficit in 2023 alone in the budget as approved by the IMF, in dollar terms, using Bank of Ghana's official exchange rate, it's more than $5 billion to close. Meanwhile, if you approve the program this year, the gap in this year's budget alone is more than what the IMF program could bring over 3 years. So the IMF knows very well that without assurance of either debt relief or fresh funding from Ghana's multilateral and bilateral partners, the program can only achieve limited effectiveness.
In other words,
this is where we are now.
Okay, I'm grateful. Sam, let me give you the final word, and I'll give you a quick 30 minutes to Dr. Holber. So here we are. Americans are here. They will leave. Our president, you just confirmed, is back in the U.S. It's an interesting one, right? The vice president is here. Our president is in the U.S. What a relationship. So sum it up for me. In the end, overall, this is a win for Ghana?
Yes, it's a feather in the cap of our bilateral relations. And you see, we should have a strategy. I've always had issues with Africa summits taking place elsewhere. I mean, the last U.S.-Africa summit up in Washington, where Biden pledged about $55 billion. So don't forget that is also at stake. So probably some of Ghana's calculations could be how much they could get into that pie. But as Professor Bokbin said, it's time to have a strategy, and it's time to present a common united front. And now that there is a renewed scramble for Africa, we should be more strategic. We should not rush to, if you like, take sides and limit the benefits, what we can get. Because this is such an opportune time. I mean, imagine if you had a master player in international relations, like Nkrumah at this time.
But the president used to be a former foreign minister.
If you had the Osajifo at this time, that China has a renewed interest in Africa, Russia has a renewed interest in Africa, the US, and even the Europeans, you see a certain clear vision, a master plan that will then channel all of these interests into our national interest that benefits us. Because you see, they have a plan, they have an agenda. Biden is talking about all in. The US is now all in Africa, is interested in Africa's future. What is our strategy? How do we want to make sure that that interest in Africa inures to our benefit, so that it's not another, if you like, neo-colonial arrangement that after some decade or two, we realized that this new scramble for Africa, it was like the old scramble, the colonial era. It only benefited them. It was a one-way, a skewed affair which did not benefit the African people. So it's time for vision, it's time for strategy, it's time to look at the African agenda and our national interest as we navigate this very
interesting thoughts in this. And Dr. Holobam, apologies there because my producers will kill me if I don't get off the set. But thank you, gentlemen, for your time. I mean, this is a very interesting conversation, and we'll see when we get the IMF program. Maybe we'll look back and analyze what role the Americans played. But what about the Chinese? It's interesting. The West, the Paris Club that America is part of, I've told us if we don't get China to come to the table, they aren't helping us. So what does that say about America and the 22 other members at the Paris Club? Make of that what you will. Enjoy the rest of your evening.